Hi everyone, Effie here. Today I'm going to make this card using our new Blooming Peony Garden background stamp. I'll be doing some watercoloring over the embossed image. So I'm going to start off by inking up my 6x6 red rubber cling stamp with some Versamark ink, which is a clear sticky ink, and then I'm going to apply my watercolor paper panel right over the stamp. And to help get a nice crisp, smooth impression, I use my Speedball Baron tool to help me get some nice even pressure. Then I spooned on some of our rose gold embossing powder and hit the whole panel with my heat tool, melting all of that gorgeous rose gold powder. For today's watercoloring, I'm going to be using my Dr. P.H. Martin's Radiant Watercolors. These are liquid watercolors that come in these glass bottles. So if they've been sitting for a while, you just want to give them a good shake before you put them in any palette. I'll be doing some wet on wet watercoloring techniques today. So I started off by wetting the area that I want to paint first with some clean water, and I use two paintbrushes to do this. I have a medium tip and a fine tip brush. I think it's a medium tip. Sometimes it's hard for me to distinguish the medium and large tip on camera because when I paint, I kind of just grab whatever is near me. So the medium and large tip aqua brushes are not too different, but for purposes of watercoloring this larger peony image, it doesn't really matter which one you use. You can even use two fine tip brushes if you have. And if you don't have water brushes, you can just use regular paint brushes. So the hues that I'm using the Alpine Rose and the black for the leaves. And the set of watercolors that I'm using is the set A, and you can usually find that on Amazon. So I really love this bright pink watercolor paint. It's so bright and so pink and just really, really pretty. So after I wet the area that I want to paint first with some clean water, I start dropping in bits of pigment, but I put more pigment down towards the, I guess, center of the flower where the leaves are coming out. So you want those areas to be darker, and then you want the color to blend out or get lighter as you get closer to the edges of the petal. And for blending purposes, that's why I use two brushes. I use my fine tip brush, which I use to dip into the actual paint and apply the paint to my paper. And then I use the larger tip brush to blend the color out. That second larger tip brush stays clean. I don't really dip the larger tip into the paints. This helps the actual painting process go by a little bit faster because you're not cleaning off the one brush after you dip it into the pigment to blend the color out. So when you switch off between the two brushes, the painting just goes by a little bit faster, and it's just a little bit more convenient because you're not really wiping the brush off quite as often. As I paint my watercolors, I kind of go in layers. I put down kind of a base layer of color, and it usually comes out a little lighter, but then I will go back in and rework certain areas. For example, I will go back and add a little bit more paint to the areas closer to the center of the blooms because I want the inner petals to be darker, because anywhere that's located more inside the flower, as you go deeper towards the flower, there is less light, so it's going to be darker. So you want your darker shading to be located towards the inner portions of your petal. And then as you get towards the edges of the petal where the petal is exposed to more light, the color gets lighter. And that is why I blend the color out with that second brush. And if you want to add a little bit more impact, you don't want to blend the color out all the way to the edge. You want to leave a little bit of white space. And this is a tip that I learned from one of Kathy Rakusen's video. So after I paint the Alpine Rose hue onto my peony blooms, I'm going to go ahead and start coloring in the leaves. Instead of using the traditional green, I'll be using black. I'm going to employ the same watercoloring technique, the wet on wet watercoloring technique, to paint in the leaves. So I start off with going with a light gray base layer, and then after that first base layer of colors on, I'm going to just go back and add a little bit more black watercolor paint in the inner corners of my leaves. And this is just going to add a little bit of depth and variation to the entire panel. Once I finished painting, I set the panel aside to dry completely, and then I took the largest die from our double stitch rectangles small collection. Now, the largest die in this die collection will cut out your panel to slightly smaller than an A2 size panel. When I go to mount this painted panel onto an A2 base later on, I'm going to be left with a nice bright white border. Next, I'm going to take the Happy Wordplate die from our Bold General Wordplate Greetings die collection, and I'm just going to die cut this sentiment from black cardstock. Then I'm going to take our Scripty Hugs word die and die cut this from white cardstock. My sentiment will read sending happy hugs. So the happy and the hugs, I'm going to use the word die cuts. The sending portion of the sentiment will be used from another stamp set, which I'm just going to white heat emboss onto black cardstock. I saved the negative portion from my happy word die cut because I use it to help me position my sentiment. Next, after I decided where I'm going to place my sentiment, I'm going to start popping everything up with dimensional foam tape, and I'm starting with the Y and working backwards from there. After I pop up all the words, or rather all the letters, I'm going to pop up the hugs die cut, and I just cut really skinny strips of foam tape to adhere this down. Next, I just popped up my sending portion of the sentiment, which was white heat embossed onto black cardstock. The sending sentiment is from our Folk Hummingbird set. Next, I took strips of our double-sided adhesive sheets, which I just cut down with my trimmer, and I applied the strong adhesive to the back of my painted panel. Next, I'm going to mount my painted panel onto a side-folding A2 card base. Lastly, I embellished my card using our mixed size dewdrops. These are clear dewdrops in our 7 and 5 millimeter sizes. And my card is now complete. As always, thank you all for watching. I really enjoyed making this bright and dimensional card using our Blooming Peony Garden background stamp. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.